Welcome to the second module of the Global Education Cluster's Core 1 training on coordination. My name is Arpana Pandey, and I'm a member of the Global Education Cluster's Rapid Response team. My presentation will focus on the humanitarian program cycle, specifically what the humanitarian program cycle is and its key elements, the key outputs of the humanitarian program cycle, namely the humanitarian needs overview and the humanitarian response plans, and how coordination and information management are key enablers. The humanitarian program cycle is an operational framework developed by the Interagency Standing Committee. It sets out the sequence of actions that are required to prepare for, plan, manage, deliver, and monitor a collective humanitarian response. The humanitarian program cycle is an interagency process led by the humanitarian coordinator and managed by the humanitarian coordination team. It is supported by clusters and cluster coordinators, government counterparts, and civil society organizations. The humanitarian program cycle is centered around the affected population. In each of the stages, the affected population should be consulted and engaged meaningfully throughout the cycle. The humanitarian program cycle is made up of 6 key elements and 2 key enablers. The 6 key elements are the following: needs assessment and analysis, strategic planning, resource mobilization, implementation and monitoring, operational peer review and evaluation, and emergency preparedness. 2 key enablers are coordination and information management, as can be seen in the inner ring, and the affected population is at the center of this cycle. Now, if we zoom in and look at the individual elements, needs assessment and analysis essentially forms the evidence base for the response. It enables the humanitarian community to have a shared understanding of the needs. Now, needs assessment and analyses can take various forms. It could be a secondary data review, primary data collection. The education cluster, for example, might carry out a joint needs education assessment or be part of a multi-sectoral needs assessment, the findings of which would inform the humanitarian needs overview. So essentially, the work around needs assessment and analysis is crucial to informing the humanitarian needs overview for the response. Now, strategic planning builds on the previous step and enables the humanitarian community to have a very strategic response to effectively respond to the needs identified. Now, strategic planning is a collaborative process. This is the process where the humanitarian community defines and articulates the key objectives and priorities for the sector. The work done in this stage informs flash appeals and the humanitarian response plans. Now, resource mobilization is about fundraising, as outlined in flash appeals or humanitarian response plans. This alignment enables the funding to be strategic and ensure that donors are funding key objectives and priorities. Now, implementation and monitoring is a continuous process, and essentially it allows the humanitarian coordination team to assess whether sufficient progress is being made vis-a-vis the targets and objectives set out in humanitarian response plans. It enables further resource mobilization and provides strategic direction to the response. Operational and peer review and evaluation is an internal interagency tool that determines whether course corrections or adjustments are needed. And emergency preparedness is a key element that takes place throughout the cycle and ensures that the response plans have built in some measures of contingency in case of a further deterioration in the security or conflict in the country. These 6 key elements combine with the 2 enabling factors to form a single seamless process that runs throughout the cycle of interagency coordination and response. Now that we've looked at the humanitarian program cycle, how can we apply the humanitarian program cycle to different crises? And here you will see the humanitarian program cycle mapped onto the different key processes that take place during a sudden onset. Now, in a sudden onset, decisions often have to be taken very quickly with limited or incomplete information. There's an urgent need to provide direction to the response to allow for the mobilization of action and resources. And as you can see here at the bottom are the different elements of the humanitarian program cycle and how they map and match to different steps during a sudden onset. Now, in terms of the protracted crisis, situations of prolonged conflict or post-conflict, the humanitarian program cycle looks a little bit different. The needs assessment, needs analysis, and strategic planning typically take place on an annual basis, and often the timeline is August till the end of November. However, the planning timeframe can start at any point during the year, and the duration could take as many months as possible. This depends on operational requirements. So as you can see here, you have the different elements of the humanitarian program cycle mapped against the months of the year. Now, humanitarian response plans are interagency, intersectoral plans. As you can see in the diagram, they're based on the humanitarian needs overview. They're built around a common set of humanitarian issues. They put forward agreed objectives for the humanitarian community. They also articulate capacity and access issues. The humanitarian response plans also articulate the targets. What is the number of beneficiaries that the humanitarian community will seek to cover with an intersectoral response, and the financial targets. So essentially, the humanitarian response plans serve as an appeal to mobilize funding. Now, the humanitarian response plan is made up of two components. The first is country strategy, and the second are cluster plans. Now, the country strategy provides an overview of the crisis, an overview of the needs related to the emergency. In the country strategy, the humanitarian community articulates clear objectives and priorities. And in terms of the cluster plans, this is where the different sectors outline their plans. So in the case of the education cluster, the cluster plan, education cluster plan, would outline what the education community intends to do to address the education-related needs of the affected population. And here you can see how the education chapter feeds into the humanitarian response plans. Essentially, what does the education chapter look like? What are some of the key elements? Now, the education inputs for the humanitarian response plans involves a needs analysis. So what are the education-related needs of children and youth affected by emergencies and conflict? And this information would also feed into the humanitarian needs overview. The education chapter would also articulate the caseload. So essentially the number of people, number of children and youth and teachers in need of education assistance. It would outline the prioritization. So what of the people in need, how many would be targeted? And what geographical locations would be prioritized? What are some of the key activities that would be prioritized? The plan also articulates the sort of response framework for the sector. What are the cluster's strategic objectives? How are they aligned to the overall objective of the different sectors, the overall intersectoral objectives? What are the key activities? What are some of the key indicators? And also, there's a piece around monitoring. So what are some of the indicators? How often will they be monitored? So that the education cluster can have a sense of whether sufficient progress is being made vis-a-vis the targets as outlined in the education cluster plan.